In the late summer of 1849, Mercy House Orphanage stood on the crest of Walnut Hill, its whitewashed walls catching the heat like bleached bone under a sky that refused to move. The road up was narrow and dusty, and wagons slowed as if the hill itself were holding its breath. Sister Constance Vale kept the front door polished until the wood shone, and the townsfolk said charity lived behind that door, that her hands never trembled when passing a bowl of stew or tying a ribbon in a girl's hair. They did not see how the shutters closed an inch at a time as soon as visitors stepped back onto the road, or how the courtyard fell quiet in a single heartbeat. Inside, the air tasted faintly of lye and old linen. Children moved the way soldiers drilled. Steps counted, eyes lowered, fingers tucked neatly out of sight. Every bed was aligned with the next, so that if one pillow shifted, the entire row appeared wrong, and looking wrong was a sin that earned attention. The floorboards bore faint chalk lines dictating where toes should stop, where chins should point, where hands should rest at night so that the sheets stayed flat until morning. No one shouted here. Commands arrived in a calm voice that pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck, steady and inescapable, leaving no bruise but leaving its mark. In the kitchen, cups of equal size sat in a perfect row like a line of teeth, each filled to the same measure. In the schoolroom, slates were traced with letters formed by rulers so no curve strayed. When a child coughed, the sound barely rose above a breath, and the others stared forward, counting silently until the room felt still again. Sister Constance praised silence the way others praised sunlight. She called it proof that the heart had learned its proper beat. At mealtime, she blessed the bread and watched the children chew in unison. On Sunday evening, she walked the dormitory with a lantern whose wick was always trimmed to the exact same length, so the light never flickered. The town's ledgers showed adoptions. Neat names moved from one column to another with tidy loops of ink. Yet no family ever returned to visit, and no letter arrived bearing childish handwriting or pressed flowers. People explained it away with hope. Perhaps new lives began far away. But the laundry lines behind the house held uniforms in the same sizes week after week, and the storeroom kept the same number of cups. When a wagon arrived carrying a small trunk, a child vanished, and by the next day's dust, another arrived keeping the dormitory count unchanged. The hill remembered what the town forgot. After lights out, the building made soft clicks like teeth setting in the dark. A night jar would tap against the glass, then fly away. Beneath her lamplight, Sister Constance wrote in a private ledger, one column for arrival, one for rest, and believed with an unwavering calm that bodies must obey the pattern before souls could be made clean. Tomorrow she would choose a name. In the weeks that followed, the visiting reverend from Kentucky could not shake the peculiarity he had seen during his brief stop at Mercy House. At first, it had seemed like a quirk of formality. Each child he greeted was introduced by Sister Constance with a composed smile and the same name, Mary. Not just the girls, even the boys who stood stiff in their plain brown coats were Mary first, followed by another name that sounded like an afterthought. Mary Thomas, Mary Elise, Mary Jonathan. She explained it in that patient, measured tone, saying it was a tradition meant to unify the orphans under the protection of the Holy Mother. The Reverend had nodded at the time, unwilling to question a woman with such apparent discipline and moral standing, but the image lingered. The children's voices when they spoke their names were flat, as if rehearsed too often to hold any individuality. It was not the unity of siblings he had felt in that room. It was the erasure of something essential. Within Mercy House, the stripping of a child's name was the first ritual upon arrival. The moment their feet crossed the threshold, their original name was never to be spoken again. Sister Constance would take them into the small chapel at the end of the hall, where the windows were too high to see through and the air smelled faintly of pressed lavender. There she would ask them to kneel before the altar and recite their new name 3 times. Each recitation was followed by a pause in which she would watch their lips, making certain the syllables were precise. Sometimes she would correct the way they pronounced the Mary, a softer consonant, a longer vowel, until she was satisfied the old name was gone from their tongue. A slate was brought out, and the child was instructed to write Mary in careful script, over and over until the chalk nub pressed into their skin left a ghost of the word on their fingertips. The other children were forbidden to whisper or recall the past name of any newcomer. It was spoken once only in the office, when Sister Constance wrote it in the hidden ledger and drew a single line through it. That book was never left in sight, and it was not the same one the church committee reviewed. The public records would reflect a flawless adoption chain, every child placed with distant fictitious families, every note written in her delicate slanting hand. But behind the closed door of the chapel, the taking of the name was more than paperwork. It was the first fracture in the child's sense of self, and she was skilled at widening it. Mary Thomas had once been Samuel from a river town a day's ride away. He had been in the house for only 3 days before he stopped turning his head when someone spoke his birth name through the fence. Mary Elise had been Clara, though she no longer remembered the sound of it. Sister Constance rewarded such forgetting with small privileges, an extra piece of bread, a longer time in the courtyard, always accompanied by the quiet reminder that Mary was loved but the other name was not. It was spoken of as if it were a stain, a dangerous remnant that would invite the world's cruelties if left intact. This ritual was not an act of devotion but a calculated dismantling. By replacing every identity with the same one, Sister Constance made the children interchangeable in her eyes. Parts of a single construct she could shape as she pleased. No child in Mercy House belonged to themselves. They belonged to Mary, and Mary belonged to her. The townspeople saw the names written neatly in the church registry and mistook the repetition for piety. They did not see how sameness was the first step toward disappearance. And as the Reverend's carriage rolled away from Walnut Hill that autumn, the sound of the children's monotone voices still clung to him, reciting their shared name like a prayer that did not end. Elias Broom arrived at Mercy House with the naive conviction of a young man recently apprenticed in medicine, his satchel packed with instruments and the belief that healing was the noblest calling. He had been sent by the parish to perform routine health examinations on the children, but from the moment he stepped into the infirmary, something in the air unsettled him. It was not the smell of antiseptic, though the sharp tang of lye stung his nose, nor the stillness of the children who waited their turn in perfect rows. It was the absence of anything personal. There were no scattered toys, no smudges of fingerprints on the windows, no half-folded blankets. Everything had its place, and nothing in that place suggested a child had ever truly lived there. While checking the cabinet for bandages, Elias noticed a narrow gap between the back panel and the wall. Curiosity and a faint sense of unease made him pull it forward. Behind it, tucked into the shadows, was a ledger bound in cracked leather, the corners worn as though thumbed often. It was heavier than expected, and when he opened it, his breath caught. Each page listed a child's arrival date in neat, identical handwriting, followed by an age and a brief note about their health. But what struck him most was the final column, the one headed Rest. Every name ended with a date less than a year from their arrival, no matter their age, and no two rested longer than 12 months after entering Mercy House. There was no mention of adoption, no indication of where they had gone. The word rest seemed to be the only conclusion to their time here. And under that column, written in the same even script, was the same phrase again and again. The lamb is at rest. Elias turned more pages, scanning the careful lines. Each entry felt less like a record and more like a ritual, as if the words themselves were a prayer or a binding. The uniformity was suffocating. No corrections, no smudges, no hesitation in the pen strokes. It was the handwriting of someone who had no doubt in their purpose. He thought of the public church registry he had seen in town, where each child was marked placed with a family. None of those families were named here. In this private book there was no world beyond Mercy House, no second life. When Sister Constance entered the infirmary, her eyes went immediately to his hands. She said nothing, only extended them toward the ledger. Her fingers did not tremble as she took it, but her gaze lingered on him in a way that felt colder than a threat. Without a word, she slid it back into the hidden gap, and the cabinet pressed flush against the wall again, erasing all sign it had been moved. She spoke then, her voice low and even, telling him the children were her lambs and a shepherd knew when each must be led to rest. She left before he could reply, the faint scent of lavender trailing behind her like a curtain closing. That night, Elias lay in his narrow bed at the guest house, replaying the column of names in his mind. The ledger had not spoken of accidents or illness, and the identical phrasing for each child was too deliberate to be coincidence. He tried to convince himself that rest was only a euphemism for adoption, but the word in her voice had sounded final, as if it meant something else entirely. The more he thought about the dates, the more he noticed an invisible countdown ticking away the moment each child arrived. Every Mary had a number of days, and every number ended the same way. By morning, Elias understood that in Mercy House, time was not a measure of life. It was a measure of how close you were to vanishing. The first thing anyone noticed upon entering the dormitories of Mercy House was the arrangement. Beds lined in faultless symmetry, each blanket tucked with exacting folds, pillows pressed flat to an identical height. It was more than cleanliness. It was geometry, enforced as though the very air in the room demanded obedience. Between each bed was a measured span of floor, marked faintly by chalk lines that only the children seemed to see. These lines dictated where one could stand, how far a hand could reach, even the path one's eyes might take when turning the head. No one crossed them without cost. Breaking the pattern even by an inch meant enduring what Sister Constance called the correction. It was never announced aloud. The words traveled through the orphanage like a chill wind, unspoken but understood. A child taken for correction did not cry out. There were no screams to confirm what had been done. Instead, the chosen was led silently to the long, narrow room at the rear of the house, a place the others called the frame hall, and returned hours later with eyes dulled and a stiffness in their movements, as though something inside had been tightened too far. For days afterward, they would walk slowly, back straighter than the others, unable to bend fully or sit without flinching. It was not until years later, when the building was being stripped for repairs, that the method of this correction came to light. Hidden behind a false panel were 3 iron frames, each built to precise human proportions, their cold surfaces smoothed from repeated use. These were not instruments for restraint in the crude sense. They were devices of shaping. Hinged plates clamped around shoulders, hips, and knees, forcing the body into angles that mirrored the geometry of the dormitory itself. Thin straps at the neck kept the head perfectly upright, so the eyes could never drop in submission or rise in defiance. The pressure was calibrated not to break bone but to stretch ligaments, to realign posture until it became permanent. The damage was subtle but lasting, a curvature to the spine, a rigidity in gait, a tremor in the hands from nerves pinched too long. Sister Constance believed that disorder in the body bred disorder in the soul. To her, a slouched back or a head turned too quickly was proof of a heart not yet cleansed. In her mind, pain without visible wound was a mark of discipline, a scar that could be carried into heaven without shame. She called the frames her molds, and in private she wrote that each child must be poured into the correct shape before they could be set free. The correction, she claimed, was mercy, a way of sparing them from the deformities of the world outside. The children learned quickly to measure their every movement against the invisible grid of Mercy House. They would lie awake at night, eyes tracing the edges of their blankets, counting the inches to the wall, rehearsing each gesture so that nothing strayed from expectation. It was not fear of pain that held them in place, but the knowledge that their very bodies could be taken from them and remade. The dormitory, once seen as a place of rest, became a silent map of survival. And in that silence, Sister Constance's order settled deeper, like a pattern etched into the bones themselves. Sunday mornings at Mercy House carried a stillness that felt different from the rest of the week. Not the restful quiet of the Sabbath, but the kind that made the skin prickle. The children rose before dawn, washed in water so cold it numbed their hands, and lined up in pairs for chapel. Sister Constance walked ahead of them, her keys swaying softly at her side, the brass catching slivers of the early light. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with the scent of lavender oil and something sour beneath it, a faint, curdled edge that no incense could hide. At the center of the altar stood 3 basins, each deep enough to submerge a child's head. They were not filled with clear water as tradition would dictate. Instead, a strange, pale liquid glistened under the light, milk thickened with ground ash from the orphanage's hearth. The ash gave it a grayish hue, swirling faintly when disturbed, and carried a faint bitterness that clung to the air. Sister Constance called it the baptism of renewal, a ritual she claimed would purge the lingering impurities of the children's lives before Mercy House. One by one she would summon them forward. The child would kneel, hands clasped, and she would recite a prayer in a slow, deliberate cadence. Without warning, her hands would seize the back of their head and press them down into the basin. The first seconds were always the same. The muffled splash, the sudden resistance as lungs demanded air, the frantic kick of legs against the wooden floor. But she held them there until their struggles weakened, until the thin line between surrender and unconsciousness was reached. Then, as abruptly as it began, she would lift them out, the thick liquid dripping from their hair, running down their faces, stinging their eyes, and filling their noses with the acrid burn of ash. The milk was never warm. Its chill shocked the skin, and its weight seemed to cling to the throat, making each gasp a painful swallow. The ash scratched at the inside of the mouth if any was inhaled, coating the tongue with a taste that could not be washed away for hours. She would tell them afterward that the burn in their chest was the cleansing of sin, that the heaviness in their limbs was proof of spiritual rebirth. Those who coughed or cried received the same soft admonishment. They were not yet ready. No marks remained on the body, but the ritual left something deeper. The children began to dread the sound of water. Even the simple filling of a wash basin for laundry made some flinch. They learned to hold their breath for long stretches in the dark, practicing in their beds at night, as if training for the next time their faces would be forced under. It became a private contest, and each child measuring how long they could endure before panic set in, though none dared speak of it aloud. In her private writings, later found in a sealed drawer, Sister Constance described the ritual not as cruelty but as shaping. She believed that fear was the first layer to be peeled away from the soul, and only in that moment when the body hovered at the edge of death could true obedience take root. To her, the baptism without water was not punishment. It was preparation. For rest, for silence, for the shape she believed heaven required. And so, every Sunday, the basins waited, filled anew, their still surfaces reflecting the narrow windows above like pale, unblinking eyes. Mary Elise had always been quieter than the other children, even by Mercy House's standards. At 9 years old, her frame was thin, her posture perfect, her gaze fixed on nothing for long stretches of time. She seemed to move through the orphanage like a shadow that had forgotten its source. On the final evening she was seen, the dormitory was dimly lit by the single lantern Sister Constance allowed to burn past sunset. Mary Elise stood at the far end, her back to the others, her hands clasped neatly behind her as she faced the wall. She did not turn when the lantern passed over her, nor when the whispered prayers of the younger children rose and fell in the stillness. By morning her bed was stripped bare, the mattress rolled and tied with twine. The wooden frame dusted and chalked along the edges as if sealing it off from the rest. Her name was not spoken at breakfast. The older children knew better than to ask. Sister Constance told the younger ones that Mary Elise had been adopted during the night, that a good family from far away had come quietly to spare her the pain of saying goodbye. It was the same explanation they had heard before, and it was always enough to end the questions. But there were no signs of departure, no wagon tracks on the road, no trunk missing from the storage room, no clothing absent from the laundry line. Only the space where her bed had been, marked by 2 faint lines of chalk and the knowledge that something once there was gone. Years later, when Mercy House was abandoned and time had pried the floorboards loose, workers found the truth beneath that very section of the dormitory. Hidden between the joists were compartments no higher than a child's chest, each lined with faded linen that had long since frayed to dust. The wood smelled faintly of lavender, though it was the stale sweetness of something long sealed away. In the shallow space directly beneath where Mary Elise's bed had stood, the compartment was empty except for a small scrap of fabric. The same coarse cotton used in the orphanage uniforms, cut with care along the seams, as if the garment it once belonged to had been dismantled piece by piece. Other compartments yielded more: bits of ribbon, the buckle from a child's shoe, a hairpin bent in half. There were no bodies, no bones, nothing that could be called a grave. But the precision of the spaces and the ritual care in what they held spoke of deliberate intent. These were not storage areas, they were resting places of a different kind. Memorials stripped of the one thing that would name them as such. Sister Constance's private ledger listed Mary Elise's date of rest as 2 days after the night she was last seen. No cause, no note, just the same phrase as always. The lamb is at rest. In her mind, perhaps the chalk lines had been a kind of border, the edge of the world that child would occupy until the end. To the children still living above, it was a silent warning. You could vanish from Mercy House without ever leaving it. And once the space beneath your bed was sealed, it was as if you had never existed at all. The locked door above the chapel had been part of Mercy House for as long as anyone could remember, yet no child ever saw it open. The staircase leading to it was narrow and steep, tucked behind a panel in the chapel wall. Sister Constance alone carried the brass key, its bow worn smooth by her thumb. The children spoke of it in whispers, calling it the soundless room, though none could say for certain what happened there. They only knew that those who went up the stairs returned changed, not injured in ways the eye could see, but diminished somehow, as if part of their voice had been scraped away. The room itself was discovered decades later during renovations, when the rotted frame of the door finally gave way. What lay beyond was no ordinary chamber. The walls were lined in thick cotton padding, the seams stitched with looping script from the Psalms, the words carefully embroidered in black thread. The air inside was heavy and close, smelling faintly of old cloth and the faint sweetness of pressed lavender, though it carried an undertone of something stale, like breath trapped too long. In the center, arranged in perfect concentric circles, were dozens of wooden chairs. Each one was fitted with leather straps at the arms and ankles, the buckles polished and free of dust as if they had been cared for long after the room was abandoned. The spacing between the chairs was exact, no more and no less than the distance between the beds in the dormitory, as though the same invisible measurements governed both spaces. It was here that Sister Constance brought children who broke the rules of silence. The punishment was not loud or violent. It was the absence of everything. A child would be strapped into one of the chairs, their head held upright by a narrow wooden brace that prevented even the smallest tilt. Once seated, the door was closed and locked, and the room became a world without sound. The padding on the walls swallowed every noise. Even the sound of one's own breathing seemed to disappear. In that unnatural stillness, time lost its edges. Minutes became indistinguishable from hours. Some children later wrote in secret and trembling handwriting that after a while they could no longer tell if their eyes were open or shut. If a child attempted to speak or cry out, Sister Constance had a further measure prepared. She would produce a strip of cloth, sometimes freshly laundered, sometimes not, and press it into the child's mouth as a gag. But this cloth was never plain. It bore words written in the child's own hand, fragments from their daily copywork, often lines from confession exercises in which they had been made to list personal faults. She would cut these phrases from their notebooks and use them as the very thing to silence them, forcing them to choke on their own admissions. It was, in her mind, a lesson in humility, to remind them that their own words could be their undoing. Those who emerged from the soundless room often refused to speak for days afterward, not out of defiance but from something deeper, a sense that speech itself was dangerous. They moved more cautiously, avoided eye contact, and sometimes flinched at the sound of their own name. The other children treated them with a quiet deference, as if proximity to that room had marked them in a way that could not be erased. In her private writing, Sister Constance described the chamber as a place of soul alignment. She believed that by removing all sound she could strip away the noise of the mind, leaving only obedience and stillness. She compared the process to tuning an instrument, tightening strings until they produced the exact pitch she desired. The padding, she wrote, was not for comfort but for purity. No sound should contaminate the moment of transformation. The soundless room became part of the children's unspoken map of Mercy House, a place avoided yet never far from thought. The knowledge of it hung over every mealtime, every lesson, every hour in the dormitory. Silence was no longer just a rule. It was a shield, a desperate act of self-preservation. For in Mercy House, breaking silence did not simply earn punishment. It brought you closer to the place where sound itself went to die. By the spring of 1850, the children of Mercy House had learned to control even the smallest of movements. Fidgeting was rare, running unheard of, and the natural shifts of a body at rest were replaced with a rigid stillness that made the orphanage feel less like a home and more like a museum display. This was not instinct, it was conditioning, carefully cultivated through what Sister Constance called the devotion test. Her methods were not entirely her own. In the locked drawer of her desk, among the ledgers and prayer books, were letters from a European anatomist named Dr. Volker Ernst. Written in a cramped, slanting German hand, the letters discussed the limits of voluntary muscle control, the ways the body could be trained to hold unnatural positions for prolonged periods, and the effects such strain had on the nervous system. Ernst's interest was academic. Sister Constance's was devotional. To her, the body was a vessel, and if it could be made perfectly still in the service of obedience, then the soul within would follow. The devotion test took place in the West Wing, in a room bare except for a row of narrow wooden benches and a large clock mounted high on the wall. The children were positioned in exact poses, knees bent at right angles, hands flat against their thighs, shoulders drawn back until the shoulder blades ached. Heads were tilted slightly downward, eyes fixed on a single point marked on the opposite wall. Once set, they were forbidden to move. The clock's slow tick was the only sound in the room, each second stretching like a thread pulled too tight. At first, the sessions lasted an hour, but over weeks and months the duration increased. Sister Constance moved among them, her steps slow and soundless, watching for the smallest tremor in a hand or shift in a knee. A finger twitch could result in starting over. A dropped gaze might mean losing the day's bread. She never raised her voice. Her corrections came in the form of touch, a press of her palm to a spine to force it straighter, a pinch at the back of the neck to freeze a wandering head. The toll was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Muscles began to waste, joints stiffened, and circulation faltered. Children as young as 7 developed tremors that never fully left them. Some could no longer sit comfortably on the floor without pain shooting up their legs. Sister Constance noted these changes with clinical detachment in her private log, recording how long each child could maintain position before collapse and how long recovery took. In her mind, every second held was a victory, proof that the child was closer to the stillness she equated with holiness. The older children learned to detach their minds from their bodies, to focus on patterns in the wood grain of the floor, or the faint rhythm of their own heartbeat. They became experts at ignoring the pain, at letting time dissolve into a haze. But the younger ones often broke quickly, their small bodies betraying them with involuntary shifts and jerks. These failures were met with longer sessions the next day, the logic being that the only cure for weakness was more stillness. Years later, when the West Wing was dismantled, workers found faint markings etched into the floorboards. Small crosses at precise distances, each aligned with where a child's feet or knees would rest. The wood in these spots was worn smooth, polished not by care but by countless hours of unmoving contact. The benches were still there too, narrow and unyielding, the indentations in the grain shaped by bodies that had pressed into them far longer than nature intended. In the margins of her correspondence with Dr. Ernst, Sister Constance had written her own observations. She noted that a child who could remain in position without strain eventually showed less resistance in all things. To correction, to ritual, even to the erasure of their own identity. Stillness was not merely physical, it was the death of will, and she considered it the purest form of devotion. The children of Mercy House understood this lesson well. They carried it in the way they moved, or rather in the way they didn't. Even outside the West Wing, they sat at meals without shifting, stood in lines without swaying, lay in bed without turning. Motion itself became dangerous, a signal that you might still think you owned your body. And in Mercy House, the body belonged to Sister Constance, just as surely as the silence and the names did. In the official town records, Mercy House suffered a small but contained fire in the spring of 1850. The entry was brief, a note in the church's quarterly report stating that smoke damage to the East Wing had required the relocation of several children. The wording was calm, the tone routine, as if the incident had been no more serious than a broken fence or a burst water pipe. No details were given about the cause, no names of the children relocated, and no follow-up inspection was scheduled. Yet anyone who lived in Walnut Hill at the time remembered that there had been no plume of smoke on the day in question. The town bell had not rung, the volunteer bucket brigade had not been summoned, and no scent of charred wood drifted down into the valley. For a supposed fire, it left no trace that reached beyond the orphanage walls. Inside Mercy House, however, something had happened. In the weeks leading up to the incident, the children spoke less and less in the courtyard, even by their usual restrained standards. Those who had been chosen for the Sunday baptism without water emerged more dazed than before, coughing not only from the ash-laced milk, but from something deeper, something lodged in the chest. Mary Claire, a thin, sharp-eyed girl of 11, had been the last to undergo the ritual before the fire. She did not return to her bed afterward. 2 others disappeared that same week, their bunks stripped bare, chalk lines drawn neatly around the empty frames. One night, long after the lamps had been snuffed, a faint chemical smell drifted through the east wing. It was not the sharp bite of wood smoke, but a different odor, acrid, almost metallic. Some of the older children later claimed they heard muffled movement from the chapel, the creak of the altar floorboards lifting, and the slow thud of something heavy being carried down into the crypt below. No one dared rise to see. The next morning, the story of the fire was delivered as fact. Sister Constance gathered the children in the chapel and explained in her unhurried voice that a minor blaze had damaged part of the east wing. Several Marys, she said, had been moved to new homes until repairs were complete. Her dress and hands bore no soot, and her keys hung clean at her waist. The walls, the floors, the air. None of it carried the scent of smoke. Only the faint chemical trace lingered, quickly masked by an overabundance of lavender oil. Years later, when the building's foundation was excavated, investigators found beneath the east wing a pit lined with scorched stone, its blackened surface sealed under decades of dust. Inside were fragments of charred fabric, not enough to form a whole garment, but identifiable as the coarse cotton of Mercy House uniforms. The edges of the cloth had burned unevenly, as if fire had met dampness and fought to consume it. Among the scraps were nails bent into unnatural curves, as though they had been pried from small wooden structures not much larger than boxes. Speculation grew among historians who studied the find. Some believed the so-called fire was an intentional burning of evidence, not of the building, but of what had been hidden within it. If a baptism without water went too far, the body left behind would be unmarked, but the stillness of death was a truth even Sister Constance could not erase. In such a case, a fire, or the story of one, provided a perfect excuse to explain the sudden absence of a child and the need for repairs that no one would inspect too closely. The church never pressed for details, and the town preferred the comfort of believing that the children had been safely relocated. It was easier than picturing the truth, that perhaps no relocation had ever happened, that the only journey those children had taken was into the crypt or the pit beneath the east wing. The official record, written in an elegant, untroubled script, would forever state simply, "Smoke damage repaired. Children placed elsewhere." In Mercy House, the absence of fire was more dangerous than fire itself. Flames would have drawn eyes, summoned help, forced the walls open to scrutiny. But a fire that existed only on paper left the walls untouched, the silence unbroken, and the truth buried in the ground, where it could smolder unseen for as long as Sister Constance wished. By the winter of 1851, Mercy House felt emptied in ways that could not be explained by the season. The once full dormitories, though never loud, now carried an almost hollow quiet, the beds fewer, the lines of chalk between them broken in places where no replacements had come. The rows at mealtime had thinned. The benches in the schoolroom were only half occupied. Outside, the courtyard stood bare, the sound of wind moving over the hill louder than the children's footsteps. Those who remained moved with an even deeper caution, as though the air itself had grown more dangerous to disturb. It was during this time that a church inspector, a middle-aged man named Walter Hensley, was sent to review the orphanage records. Hensley was known for his meticulous nature, and upon his arrival he seemed impressed by the immaculate state of the grounds. The walkways were swept, the linens pressed, the chapel candles burned cleanly without excess wax pooling at their bases. Sister Constance greeted him with her usual composure, offering tea in the parlor before presenting the public ledger. The entries were flawless, each child accounted for, each placement documented with dates and distant destinations. Yet something about the uniformity of the records pricked at him. During his visit, Hensley requested to speak with some of the children. Sister Constance obliged but selected them herself, bringing forward those whose posture and answers fit the image she wanted to present. They spoke politely, each reciting their names with the same careful enunciation, their eyes never lingering too long on his. When he asked how long they had been at Mercy House, the responses varied in months but shared one unsettling pattern. All of them referred to their time there as days away from rest. The phrase struck him as strange. None of the children said they were waiting to be adopted or to meet their new families. Only rest, spoken in the same measured tone as if quoting something memorized. Hensley noted the phrase in his diary that evening, along with his impression that the children seemed unnaturally ordered as though by some silent metronome. He intended to ask Sister Constance about it the next day. But that night a heavy snow began to fall, and with it came a change in the atmosphere of the house. The corridors were darker, the chapel colder. In the early hours, some of the children claimed they heard soft movements from the east wing. Not footsteps, but the slow drag of something across the floor. By morning, Hensley's diary would end abruptly, mid-sentence, the ink trailing off after the words, "I believe the rest she speaks of." No official report of his departure exists. The church records state only that the inspection was completed without incident and that the home was fully in order. Yet in Sister Constance's private ledger, an entry for that same day marks the rest of Mary Ann, Mary Lewis, and Mary Thomas. All 3 beds were stripped, chalked, and left vacant for weeks afterward. From that winter on, the turnover accelerated. Each month saw fewer children in the dining hall, the rows in the courtyard shrinking until only a small cluster remained. Those who had survived years in Mercy House began to carry the look of those who had already been chosen, not with relief but with resignation. They seemed to move toward their fate willingly, as if the years of silence, correction, and stillness had eroded any thought of escape. Outside the orphanage, the town took no notice of the dwindling numbers. The ledgers said the children were placed, families were said to be waiting. The snow that year was heavy and frequent, and on Walnut Hill it covered the ground so completely that no tracks marked the comings or goings. The only visible signs of life were the thin columns of smoke from the chapel chimney and the steady glow of lamplight in Sister Constance's office window late into the night. When spring came, only a handful of children remained. Their bodies were rigid, their movements nearly soundless, their faces unreadable. It was as if Mercy House itself had carved them into statues, ready to be placed in whatever final arrangement Sister Constance had planned. The outside world believed this was a home nearing the end of its service. Inside, the truth was simpler and far colder. The final year had begun, and for those who remained, the days away from rest were fewer than anyone dared count aloud. The discovery of the crypt beneath the chapel would not come until more than half a century after Mercy House closed its doors. By then, the hill had long been overgrown, the orphanage's windows boarded, its timbers sagging under the weight of years. Workmen were sent to prepare the structure for demolition, and it was during the dismantling of the altar that they found the first sign. A narrow seam in the flagstone floor hidden beneath layers of wax and dust. When the stone was pried up, the air that rose from below was stale and cold, as if it had not moved in decades. The opening revealed a steep flight of steps descending into darkness. The workmen carried lanterns down, their light casting thin, wavering shadows on the walls. The air grew damp as they descended, and the sound of their boots against the stone echoed too sharply, as though the room ahead was smaller than it should have been. At the bottom they reached a door of thick oak, its edges sealed with mortar. The hinges were rusted, but the wood itself was solid, as though someone had taken great care to keep it from rotting. It took nearly an hour to break it open. Inside was a crypt unlike any they had seen. The walls were lined with brick, the floor a smooth sweep of stone worn in shallow dips where footsteps must once have passed. In the center, arranged in precise rows, were dozens of small wooden boxes. Each box had been placed with exact spacing from the next, all facing the same direction. On top of each rested a neatly folded orphanage uniform. Coarse cotton faded to pale brown, the collars pressed flat as though awaiting inspection. The cloth had yellowed with age, but the folds were sharp, suggesting they had been laid there with deliberate care. When the first box was opened, the workmen found bones arranged in perfect anatomical order, each limb placed just as it would be in life. The skull rested at the top, the jaw bound tightly shut with thin wire. The wire had tarnished to a dull green, but it still held fast, clamping the teeth together in silence. Every other box was the same. The bones clean and dry, the jaw wired, the uniform folded above. There were no markers, no names, no indication of which Mary each had been in life. The only thing that connected them was the sameness. For the townsfolk who later heard of the find, the image of the wired jaws was the detail that lodged deepest. Some claimed it was to keep the dead from speaking in the afterlife, others that it was a final symbol of the silence Sister Constance had demanded from them in life. In her private ledger, found in the debris of her office, the last page contained a single line in her steady, measured handwriting. They go to him unspoiled, unbroken in the mouth, and in one voice. The dimensions of the crypt suggested it had been built with the chapel itself hidden from the beginning. The precision of its layout, the care in the folding of each garment, the absence of decay in the uniforms, all spoke of ritual rather than disposal. This was not a place where the unwanted were hidden. It was a place where the finished work was displayed, preserved in silence beneath the heart of the orphanage's worship. Some of the boxes were smaller, the bones inside barely formed, the uniforms cut down to size. Others contained the remains of older children, their bones showing the slight deformities of those who had endured years of correction and devotion tests, yet each was treated with the same mechanical reverence, as though age and suffering were irrelevant once the final arrangement was complete. The workmen sealed the crypt again after cataloging what they found, but its memory lingered. In the years that followed, it became the subject of whispered stories in Walnut Hill. That the chapel's floor still carried the weight of those boxes, that the air above the altar was unnaturally cold, that if you stood there too long you might hear the faint scrape of wire against bone. Whether true or not, the crypt remained the clearest evidence of what Mercy House had been, not a place for saving children, but a place for shaping them into something Sister Constance believed would please her God, and laying them to rest only when they were silent enough to stay that way forever. The confession came to light in 1924, 75 years after Mercy House had opened its doors and more than 50 since they had finally closed. It was found not in Walnut Hill, but hundreds of miles away in the archives of a convent in New Orleans. The discovery was almost accidental. A young nun named Sister Margaret was cataloging sealed correspondence from the mid-19th century when she came upon a heavy envelope marked simply, "For the Mother Superior's eyes only." The wax seal was still intact, though brittle with age, and bore the faint impression of a lamb surrounded by a ring of thorns. Inside were 8 handwritten pages, the ink browned, the script measured and deliberate. At the bottom of the final page was a signature, Sister Constance Vale. The letter was not addressed to any person in particular. Instead, it read like a testament, calm, unhurried, and chilling in its clarity. In it, Sister Constance wrote of her work at Mercy House, but not in the language of charity or care. She spoke of the shaping, of refining the vessel until it was fit for God's kingdom. She referred to the children exclusively as Mary's, calling them parts of a single soul, divided in birth but made whole in rest. She claimed that their original names were wounds of the world, and that erasing them was the first step toward salvation. The most unsettling passages described her rituals in clinical detail, not as punishments but as necessary rites. The baptism without water, she wrote, was to wash away the breath of the earth. The correction frames were to return the body to the form it was meant to hold before sin bent it. The soundless room was to silence the noise of the mind so the heart may hear him. She described the crypt beneath the chapel as the final choir, a place where each Mary, made perfect, would rest in exact alignment until called forth by the Lord. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing in the earthly sense. Instead, she justified each act as a mercy, sparing the children from the corruptions of adulthood, from the failings of flesh and thought. She wrote that to send them into the world half-formed, scarred by their first names and their restless limbs, would be the greater cruelty. In her eyes, death was not an ending but a completion of her work. One passage in particular drew the attention of historians who later examined the letter. To save one soul entire, I must break the many that make it. Each Mary is a note, and when all are in key, the song will please him. It is not my voice he will hear, but theirs, joined at last. The metaphor was cold, deliberate, and consistent with the uniformity found in her records and in the crypt itself. Sister Margaret, shaken by what she had read, brought the letter to the Mother Superior. Within days, a copy was sent to the diocese in Tennessee, where it was quietly filed away among closed investigations. No public statement was made. No inquiry launched into the full extent of what had happened at Mercy House. Officially, the matter remained buried. Unofficially, the letter began to circulate among certain church scholars and archivists. Its existence whispered about in academic circles as one of the most disturbing personal accounts ever written by a religious caretaker. A few advocated for its release, arguing that the truth should be known, that the victim's memory demanded it. Others feared the scandal would destroy what little remained of the parish's reputation in Walnut Hill. And so it stayed in shadows, its pages aging quietly in a locked drawer, much like the children it described. Silent, sealed away, preserved in their appointed order. For those who have read it, the confession leaves little doubt about Sister Constance's mind. She was not careless, nor was she driven by impulse. Her acts were methodical, planned with precision and carried out without hesitation. She did not see herself as a murderer, but as a keeper of a covenant no one else understood. A covenant written in chalk lines and folded uniforms, in wired jaws beneath stone. And perhaps that certainty, that unshakable calm in the face of her own cruelty, is what makes the letter more terrifying than the crypt, the frames, or even the empty beds. Because in her own words, she did not believe she had done wrong. She believed she had done right. Today, Walnut Hill bears little resemblance to the town that once looked up at Mercy House with quiet admiration. The orphanage itself is gone, demolished in the late 1930s after decades of disuse, but its outline remains etched in the slope of the hill, a flat, unnaturally even plateau where nothing has grown quite right since. In its place stands a small memorial of weathered stone, set into the earth where the chapel steps once began. At first glance it appears simple: a brass plaque, a narrow bench, a patch of flowers tended by volunteers. But the plaque bears only one word, repeated in two neat columns: Mary. No surnames, no dates, no distinctions. Just the sameness that once defined every child who passed through those doors. The memorial was erected after the discovery of the crypt and the subsequent quiet release of a heavily censored summary of Sister Constance's confession. Public outrage was brief and strangely muted. Perhaps because the events had happened so long ago, perhaps because the records were too incomplete to satisfy the need for certainty. Some called for the remains in the crypt to be moved to consecrated ground, but the church declined, insisting they had been buried in a place of sanctity. Others argued for opening the sealed boxes to identify the victims, but without names, there was nothing to match them to. In the end, the crypt was resealed, the memorial installed above it, and the matter left to the slow erosion of time. Yet Mercy House did not vanish from the town's memory. Stories persisted, told in low voices by older residents, of chalk lines on bedroom floors, of children who flinched at the sound of running water, of the faint smell of lavender that seemed to cling to the hill even decades after the building was gone. On certain quiet nights, those who live nearby claim they can still hear the faint tick of a clock, slow and deliberate, as though counting down to something. The revelations from Sister Constance's confession did lead to changes, though they came quietly. Tennessee law now forbids religious orphanages from altering or erasing a child's birth name. Strict adoption oversight was implemented, requiring verifiable records and follow-up visits. Unannounced inspections became mandatory for all child institutions, regardless of religious affiliation. On paper, these measures were the direct result of historical review, but in truth they were shaped by the shadow of Walnut Hill. Still, the philosophy that underpinned Mercy House, the belief that breaking a child could be a form of saving them, has not disappeared entirely from the world. Modern cases of institutional abuse echo its methods: isolation, the stripping of identity, the remolding of posture and speech until nothing remains of the person who arrived. The tools have changed, the language softened, but the root is the same. For those who visit the memorial, the experience is not one of closure, but of unease. The absence of names is intentional, meant to honor them equally, but it also erases the individuality they were denied in life. Standing before the plaque, a person might wonder how many children lay beneath, how many Marys were folded into the same final arrangement in the crypt below. There is no answer. Only the knowledge that the truth is sealed in stone and earth. Historians continue to debate Sister Constance's mind. Some label her a sadist cloaked in piety. Others see her as a zealot convinced of her own righteousness. A smaller, more unsettling view holds that she was both. That her certainty and her cruelty were intertwined, each feeding the other until they were inseparable. Her calm, deliberate tone in the confession suggests she never doubted her purpose, never considered that her rest might not be salvation but annihilation. In the end, the legacy of Mercy House is not merely the story of what happened there, but a warning of how easily such places can exist. Shielded by walls, by reputation, by the polite reluctance of the outside world to look too closely. Evil here did not shout, it did not rage, it worked in silence, in order, in perfect alignment. And it thrived because that silence was mistaken for peace. So the plaque remains, the brass darkening a little more each year, the flowers replaced every spring. Visitors stand for a while, reading the same name over and over until it begins to lose meaning. becoming not a name at all but a pattern, just as it was meant to be. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of Mercy House, that in death, as in life, its children remain only Mary, their true selves erased so completely that even memory cannot restore them. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could this,